All right. Has everyone read my quote from Gerald Weinberg? Computer programming is a human activity. One could hardly dispute this assertion, and yet perhaps because of the emphasis placed on the machine aspects of programming, many people, many programmers, have never considered programming in this light. Among programmers, there's a certain mystique, a certain waving of the hands, which takes place whenever one tries to probe the manner in which programming is done. Programming is not done in a certain way. They say it's done. Either you can program or you cannot. Some have it, some don't. So that was Gerald Weinberg in 1971. Do we understand programming any better now? So I don't think we do. But let's try. Let's see where we can get to. All right, so today we're going to be talking about a paper about the process of software development. Now, the thing I want you to get out of this is that I want to talk to you about as much the process, the methodology that they use to come up with this, as the result itself. So the core idea of that methodology and the core idea of this result, I want to inspire you. I want you to take that away and say, I can now use this to actually look at the world around me and understand it maybe a little better, maybe a little differently, maybe just, you can look around you and say, I can look at that. So, first question I want to answer is, who am I to tell you any of this? So, first of all, I'm a software engineer. I've been learning about software engineering through most of my life, and very early on in my professional career, a guy I was working with, he's like, hey, let's do this thing. It's called XP. And I was like, cool, let's try it. I don't know. So, I think XP, it was very much about the human side. And so it got me to think a lot about that. And it really sent me in that direction. And so I want to tell you about this paper because it's about that human side and because I love it. So the reason I love it is because it's well written. It uses this powerful research method that I talked about, that we'll get into. And the model that it talks about, I think we can really use. I think you can use it to look at the world and say, I understand what's going on with all those people a little bit better. So why should you listen to me about that at all? Because, well, I do have a no mouse cursor, so I can't move my notes. There we go. I do have about 17 years of experience as a professional engineer, 25 years as actually programming. So a bit of that aspect of the human components I've understood for a while. I have a master's degree in software engineering, which I find strange every time I say that, like master's degree in software engineering. But a portion of that was actually about methodologies. How do we go about the process of software engineering? And so that gave me a bit of an ability to judge the theory that they came up with. And then there's another one, which is that for the past few years, I've been working as an engineering manager. And that got me really interested in the human side of this. And so I started actually reading and studying anthropology and social sciences. I wanted to understand it better. How do you scientifically look at a group of people and say what's going on there? So in doing that, I actually started my own meetup group. It only lasted about 6 months. But in that, I read papers with a few other people where we read papers on the social side of software engineering. And during that entire thing, I came up with some criteria that I started using for what made it a good paper. And we'll get to that in a second. But this one was one of those good papers. So that's me. Once again, I just want to say the thing I want you to get out of this is the methodology they used and the theory they came up with. So, moving on. We're going to structure it 3 parts. First one is that method and design, the study, why they did it, how they went about it. Then we're going to get into the result, the theory that they actually produced, and then I'm going to walk through an example where you can see kind of how this theory shows up in interactions, how you can kind of map it to what you're seeing. All right, on to the paper. So, hopefully you all know the title of the paper since you signed up for this group. So it's called Reconciling Perspectives, a grounded theory of how people manage the process of software development. It's by Steve Adolph, Philippe Kruchten, I think that's how it's pronounced, and Wendy Hall. They're all people from the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. It was part of Steve Adolph's PhD thesis. And Philippe Kruchten, I believe, was the primary advisor on that, and then Wendy Hall was advising as well in some capacity. So I'm going to point out one thing, and this is one of the criteria I used to decide that this was actually a worthwhile paper in this field. So Steve and Philippe are both from the Electrical and Computer Engineering department, and Wendy Hall is from the School of Nursing. My criteria was that I needed papers that didn't have entirely computer scientists on it. Because what I discovered was computer scientists didn't understand people. So it's a nurse, and she's, I don't know, this is the story I'm telling myself, she influenced this paper to be so much better. So, all right. So what caused the authors to actually start studying this? Well, the thing that we know is that there's a lot of studies in academia that show that methodologies really help. You put in place a methodology, you say people follow this process, and they get better outcomes. On the other hand, we also know that there's a lot of industry data where it's kind of like, no, it doesn't seem to do anything. So you put in place this methodology, and not much really changes. It doesn't seem to change all that much. So I want to do a quick check. Does this show up in this room? So how many people here would say, if you have a software methodology and you're supposed to follow it, does it help you? Just raise your hand. Any? Oh, all right. Now I see a few people wavering. All right. Now, how many of you feel it's kind of neutral? You could kind of take it or leave it. You know what you're going to do, and it doesn't really help or hinder you that much. Anyone? All right, a few. And now, how many of you, when you hear the word methodology, you just think, that's just going to get in my way. That doesn't really help me. Okay. So, you're more on the methodology side. I was not expecting that. I have disproved my hypothesis. So the question is, they see this disconnect, and now how do they explain it? How do we explain that they do these studies and they find that there is an improvement, and then they look at industry data and say, it doesn't seem to be all that great. So the authors are really looking at it, and they say that they surmise that there's some sort of disconnect between the way that people are actually approaching software development and what the methodologies say that they should be doing. So they wanted to take a look within teams and elucidate how do people actually do the process of software development. Now, to be clear here, the authors are not looking at this and saying, here's a new methodology, go and do this. They want to describe within any methodology, within something, what are people doing to manage that thing? How do they go about actually getting that to move forward and move on? So maybe if we understand the essence of what everyone's doing day to day as they're working and trying to work their way through to produce software, then maybe we'll come up with better tools, or maybe even better methodologies, ones that better fit the way in which people actually go about doing this. And there's the key. So the researchers here, what they want to do is they want to explain the world. They don't want to test a hypothesis. They're not going out there and saying, it is X, and I want to see if X truly is true. They want to figure out how to explain how we're all interacting, how we're talking to each other, and what we're doing. And as such, this isn't really a question of measuring or applying any statistical methods. So if you read the paper, there's no equations in here, there's no t-tests, there's no sample sizes, there's no population size, there's nothing like that. What we're dealing with is qualitative analysis. And qualitative analysis is producing descriptions of the world. And in the qualitative analysis realm, there's a lot of different tools. Just like in the quantitative realm, there's a lot of tools. In the qualitative realm, there's a lot of tools. And in this case, in order to research this question of how do people actually manage the process of software development, there's a method that fits it really well. It's something called grounded theory. Now, grounded theory, this is the first thing that I want you to understand and walk away from and say, oh, that's an interesting idea. I can use that. So grounded theory, it's not one thing. It's kind of like Agile. We're going to come back to that many times. You say, oh, I do Agile, right? You're going to have to tell me a lot more. So if someone says they did a research project using grounded theory, sorry, it's a family of methodologies. There's not just one. So basically what you're doing in grounded theory is you're going to look at a social situation from the point of view of the people within it, and you're going to find a way of describing what's happening. Now, the theory is grounded because as you're doing this, everything that you say is tied back into your data. So you'll have quotations from people, you'll have observations that you can make. You might have some measurements, like counts of how often you saw something happen. But it all has to tie back into that. And that's what makes it grounded. The theory itself that you end up with is composed of what they call categories or concepts. And those concepts or categories get related to each other. Eventually, as they're producing the theory from the grounded theory method, they come up with what they call their core concept. And what they're looking for in this is something where if you look at it and you say, you know what, that seems to explain a lot of this. That seems to give me the biggest kind of bang for my buck in saying, that one thing, I can now explain most of what I'm seeing here. On the other hand, they don't want it to explain everything. You want it simple. You don't want something so complicated it's unwieldy. So they have this other criteria that goes into this often called parsimony. It's kind of like Occam's razor. Keep it simple. Explain it in a simple way, even if you can't explain it all. So this idea of qualitative analysis and grounded theory, the key, another key part of it is that what you're doing is you're not going from a hypothesis, deciding what you need to measure in the world, and measuring it and deciding if that hypothesis was true or false. That's called the deductive approach. This is called the inductive approach. What we're doing is we're taking the world and we're trying to pull out of that world all the little bits and pieces that allow us to abstract it in a way that we can actually explain it. So it's once again, it's a bit like software development. We've got this really messy business domain, and we need to extract out of that as much of our kind of logical fitting together system as we can to get it to work. All right. So going through it a little bit more, the grounded theory family tree, you could say, that they used is actually the oldest one. It was described by two researchers called Glaser and Strauss in 1967. And it was later clarified and reiterated by Glaser himself in 1978. I'll point out at this point, just like Agile methodologies, Glaser and Strauss, they went different ways. They disagreed with each other, and Strauss has his own methodology as well. So, as I said earlier, each person does this slightly differently. So you have to describe the steps that you went through. And in this case, the steps that they went through are very loose. It's very hard to pin it down. Some of the other families are very concrete about it, but in this case, it's very loose. Basically, what you're trying to do is you're gathering some data, you're looking at it, you're looking for concepts in it, your themes. And then from that, you start understanding it a little bit better. And each time you kind of ask yourself, does this fit? Does this make sense? And then almost certainly at the beginning, you say, no, it doesn't. And you go back out to the world and you say, what else can I find out there? What more can I learn? And you bring it back in and you analyze again. And at this point, your concepts probably are going to start kind of coalescing, forming together. And that's what you're looking for. How do you fit them together? And then at some point, you start finding things that fall into place, and you found that core category. And now, you notice that says saturated. So quantitative methods, when you're doing that, you're doing like a t-test, you want to check, is this hypothesis supported by the data? A critical part of that, using traditional methods, is you have to decide up front exactly how many measurements you're going to make. If you don't, if you just kind of keep measuring, that's called p-hacking. That's bad. In this case, though, you don't decide up front how many times you're going to go back and look at things. They have a different test. They have a test called theoretical saturation. So basically what it is am I still learning? If you go back to the data, if you look at what you've got, you've analyzed it, and you say, you know what, this implies to me that maybe I should find that, or I shouldn't find this. You go back to your data, and you find it. Okay, great. And then you're like, I don't know what else to look at. And you go back to your data and your observations, you try to get some more, and it stops telling you anything. Nothing else that you're finding changes the theory that you're creating. And that's your stopping point. So that's when these kinds of studies end. I imagine that they probably also end like software projects where you just kind of run out of time or money. But ideally, this is when they end, that they can't learn anymore. And at that point, well, hopefully you've got your theory. Or if at least you've got the best theory that you can come up with. So, what I just described, I don't know, maybe it sounds easy. The authors discovered it wasn't. It was very hard, but it was very rewarding. Looking at that data and coming up with those concepts and seeing what you thought was going to be your core concept slip away as you're just like, no, it's too complicated. It doesn't work. Or it doesn't explain this part. They found that they had to keep revisiting and try different ideas and look at it in different ways. And I think that's the thing. We can do this ourselves in our own lives. We can look around at our organizations and say, I've got these meeting notes, I've got my own recollections, I can take memos about what I was thinking or what I believe other people were telling me, and we can apply this. We don't have to be as rigorous as a scientific paper. So that's grounded theory. Now let's get back to the paper a little bit. So that's how they put this thing together. And remember, they're doing this entirely because they want to understand how do people go about managing this process of software development. So they used grounded theory, but on what? Who were they looking at? So they were looking at 3 different sites. A site in this case is a company. They were development teams in 3 different companies. The teams were in different kinds of companies. One was fairly small, one was medium, one was described as a large multinational company, software development company. And they were all in Vancouver, BC. So this is something to keep in mind whenever you read this kind of research. They're not trying to describe the entire world. They can't. They want to do their best with what they have. So you could say, really what they're describing is these groups in Vancouver, BC, validity. This is the core question for qualitative research, is can we believe this? And can we believe that this could apply elsewhere? So that's the question that we want to ask ourselves as we go through their result. So they did interviews with about 20 participants. They spent 42 days observing the teams as they worked. They looked at documentation that the teams made available to them, not all of them. And they just used whatever they could get their hands on to see how the interactions were going. Those 3 sites all reported that they used some form of Agile. Pretty much they all said Scrum. Even in the case when they said, and I believe it was Site 3, the large company was Site 3, even when they said, well, actually our corporate methodology is some sort of waterfall. Our team does Scrum. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Are we only looking at something that happens in a Scrum team? Or is this more general? It's a good question. So as I said, they did these interviews, they collected documentation, they did what's called participant observation, which is, in one form, it's just kind of sitting in a corner, taking notes, looking at things. And then they analyzed it. So they'd collect some, they'd analyze it, and then they'd go back. Hopefully they're going back and looking for different kinds of things the next time. Like what did they miss? What do they need to support it more? As they did the analysis, that form of analysis, they do something called coding. Coding is, I think, what in computer science we would simply call tagging. It's, I'm going to give a name to things. I'm going to pull out a name and say, yep, that, I'm going to label it this way. And that's the core thing that they do. So when they started, they couldn't have an idea of what they would find. They had to start out with the idea they don't know what they're going to find. And that's hard. So one of the things that happens is in this method, they don't do any literature search until the end. They don't look for other theories. They don't want to go into there saying, oh, I'm going to find so-and-so's theory playing out. No, that's not what they want to do. They want to forget that any of those other theories could exist until the end. And then they want to say, now that we've put this all together and we've got our idea, then at the very end, they might start bringing in influence from other theories because they want to describe that situation for those people. If it matches up with all sorts of other things, hey, that's great. That's almost like replication. It's cool. So that process of discovery and not going in with a preconceived notion or trying to fight against your bias, that's what they want. As I said earlier, as you're going through this, you'll find many concepts and you'll discard them. They said that they did. They liked the idea of bunkering at some point. They said, that's going to be the core concept. And then they said, it's too complicated. It goes into too many different things, so we had to throw it away and replace it. Because that core concept has to be minimal, cohesive, and explanatory. And they thought bunkering, at least as they were explaining it, didn't seem to do that. So, I've actually said all of that already, so I'm just going to move on. All right. Stop me blathering about grounded theory. I love it too much. All right, the result. What did they actually produce here? You've probably all been sitting there thinking, God, would you just move on? All right, here we go. Reconciling perspectives. That's what they produced. All right. One thing to know, when you're reading this kind of a paper, you'll see these underlined things. That's their concepts. For me to call them out, I'm going to be using air quotes. That's not me being sarcastic. It's just I need a way of making sure you hear the concept. And I'll probably forget a lot because trying to remember which words have quotes and which words don't, that's really hard. So the theory that they produced, you have to realize it is embedded in the software context. So that means that there's some person or entity out there requesting a work product. And some person or entity that will provide the requested work product. These are the acquirer and the supplier. They'll use these terms throughout. The differences in knowledge, understanding, and organizational ecosystem that the supplier and acquirer are going to be dealing with come into play in this theory. Because what it does is those differences in knowledge and ecosystem, those lead to what they call a perspective mismatch. And a perspective mismatch, we'll get into a bit more detail, is basically we don't all agree on what that work product actually is. Now, I think the title of the paper gave away the core concept. Can anyone guess what the core concept is? It's reconciling perspectives. So they decided, I said they threw away bunkering. Bunkering will show up again, but they decided bunkering wasn't the one. Reconciling perspectives, that's what we're doing. What we're doing all the time is reconciling perspectives. So as the group or team is working its way through this struggle of producing that work product, they've got all these forces on them that are creating these perspective mismatches, and some forces that are bringing those mismatches back together, so you kind of reconcile our perspective. As I said, it's not in a vacuum. You've got this whole ecosystem. You've got your organization around you. All of that plays into how this works out. Now, perspective mismatch, it's probably pretty clear just from the name that different people have different perspectives. They get a mismatch when they don't match up. But really, what does it mean to go and reconcile it? It's probably more complicated than just simply, oh, now I do. It's like, that doesn't, no, there's more to it. All right. So first of all, what is a perspective mismatch? They identified 4 different categories of perspective mismatch. So they had perspective mismatches on features, on priorities. So features are, what is this thing supposed to be? Priorities are, which work should we be doing now and which work later? Method and work products, are we doing TDD or are we not? And then schedule and status. So are we on track? I think we're going to deliver on time. You're sitting there like, no. That's a perspective mismatch. We're not agreeing on what's going on. So when you talk in your teams about, yeah, we're not on the same page, or we're not aligned, what you're talking about is what they call perspective mismatches. All right. Almost all of my slides are text. You'll probably notice I broke all those rules because there is nothing else in this paper except this. I got to use a picture. So this is their theory in a nutshell. So the theory is both iterative and it's recursive. So it's iterative because it's just going to keep happening again and again and again. We're in Groundhog Day. The perspective mismatches just keep coming back and they're going to keep getting worked on. But it's also recursive because I might be working with Jeff and we've worked out a perspective mismatch, and that the agreement is that I now need to go and do something with another group. And so I've worked it out with him, I'm working with you now, and now we've got all of our perspective mismatches, and then I come out of that thinking, we got it, and I go back to Jeff and it turns out, no, we didn't. So it's recursive in that sense as well. So there's nowhere to start. It is everywhere. So I'm just going to start here, reaching out. All right, so what the story here is reaching out happens when some individual notices that something's not matching up. I'm talking to someone, I'm getting some sort of feedback, and it doesn't match my expectation. Now what has to happen is 2 things. I have to be getting communication, and I have to be thinking about it. Reaching out then happens when I say, I don't like this, and I want to find some way of understanding what's going on. So I reach out to someone, and I reach out to John. It's great having people here that I know their names. I reach out to John, and I say, John, you were saying that this is supposed to be blue. but it's not blue in any other thing I'm finding, and blue doesn't make any sense in this case. Can we talk about it? I've reached out. So once I've reached out, John has to agree. John doesn't have to agree, but for this to continue, he has to agree. So now if John agrees, we're now going to start negotiating. And we're going to talk about this. And this could go really fast. The negotiation could happen in the matter of seconds. John could say, I never said it was blue. I'm sorry. I never thought, sorry. Yeah, it's not supposed to be blue. You're right. It's supposed to be that other thing. I'm like, oh, cool. Okay. Done. Or John could say, this is not my call. We got to go take this back to the head honcho and get the whole UX team working on this again, because that color is probably really important. So the negotiation process is about exchanging information. It's about coming to a common understanding of what's going on. And maybe mine was right. Maybe neither of us were right. And the negotiation is trying to figure that out. Could happen in seconds, could happen in months or years. They did point out that there was an observed failure mode of negotiation. And that's when the negotiation never ended in what they called a consensual perspective. So this is the point where we've talked about it, we've come to an agreement. That agreement is we have somewhat consensual perspective. We'll consent to go along with this for now. But if it never reaches that, that was a failure mode that they identified. The whole system just stops working, is my take on it. And the key to that is because without that, the perspective mismatch has to continue. There's no reconciling of it. All right, so once we get this consensual perspective, then you can move on. But how? So in reaching out and negotiating, we were opening ourselves up to more communication. We were saying, I need to talk to others, I need to get more information, I need to get feedback. The next stage, though, is actually about cutting off communication. We've reached this consensual perspective, and now we need to start working on it. So we're now going to go into bunkering. That thing that they said, maybe that was their core concept? No, it's not, but it's still important. So the next thing that they need to do is go into this bunkering phase where they're going to start cutting off communication. Or they're going to be exposed. There's a trade-off here in this phase. So the bunkering is where we're actually going to be working on that work product, that thing that we think is described by our consensual perspective. We're going to put that work product together, and we're going to produce that. Now, during that time, the bunkering, you're either exposed or cut off, and that cuts both ways. We get to produce our work product by being cut off. But cutting off also means that we're missing that communication for us to notice a perspective mismatch that we can then correct for. However, being exposed, which means that you're still getting all that information, means that you could just be going and chasing after one idea after another and never actually producing that work product, which means that the idea of reconciling perspectives can't continue if you never produce that thing. Finding that balance between cut off and exposed, the authors, the researchers, they put that on what they called leadership. Personally, I had a slight problem with using that term for this, but sure, we'll go with it. It's all just words applied to ideas. All right. So they said the leader shelters the team from unwanted changes in the ecosystem, but themselves stays open to communication. So you can kind of think of it as what they're seeing is this leadership, this leader role. They're kind of doing that. Have you ever heard of it referred to as like the shit umbrella? Or or protect the bubble is a term used on my teams. The leader is there to get some communication so that they're still a bit open, that they can still find some perspective mismatches, but that the rest of the group can continue working without too much distraction. So that's how they found that they dealt with this kind of trade-off. So once they've produced that work product, the next thing is actually the moment of truth. Have they reconciled perspectives or not? And to do that, what they do is they go into what's called, I've just forgotten what it's called. Accepting, yes. They go into accepting. And in accepting, what they do is they take this work product and they take it to the acquirer, John, and they say, John, this is what we produced. We think we understood what you wanted. Is this right? Is this what you wanted? Is it? It's not. So am I wrong? It was, okay, he's rejected my work product. We did not actually come to a correct consensual perspective. We haven't reconciled yet. But now I've got more information because I've just tested what I thought was going to be the right thing with him, and I found out it wasn't. So now we get to decide what we do with that. Does he say, you guys are all fired, get out? That's a perspective mismatch that you want to reconcile pretty fast. Or does he say, you know what, let's talk about this and figure out what's going on here. And maybe we go back to bunkering, we figure it out, and then we move on. The other possibility is that he says, yes, that is what I wanted. Great. We have evidence that we all understand the world in the same way. It's not proof that we understand the world in the same way, but it's evidence. So we're getting there. We have now reconciled our perspective. And that's really it. So those kind of 4 major steps where you go from reaching out to negotiating, to bunkering, to accepting. What they said that they found was that those 4 steps happening again and again and again seem to explain most of what they saw in these teams. That's it. So, can we get an example of this? Can we use this for anything? Is it good? Can it help us? That's a much larger question than I'm going to try to answer right now. But maybe we can discuss this right after this. Find out. So the thing that I find it useful for is it's just like any theory in physics or biology. It's not the truth. It's not a reality. But it's an explanation that we can use to understand the world out there in hopefully a useful way. I think it's, what is the quote? There's many models that are wrong, but some are useful. So, I get to use the picture again. All right. So the example I'm going to use is something that actually happened to me a few weeks ago. Thing to understand about this is that there's kind of 2 groups in play. I'll call it, there's the outer group and there's the inner group. And my position, the perspective I'll be using to tell this story is I'm in the middle. I hear stuff from the outer group, and then I need to communicate that and work with the inner group. There is more communication than that, but it's an easy model. So, maintains. This request came from that outer group. And the way the request was worded when I got it, it seemed a bit vague to me. I could interpret it in many different ways, and I wasn't sure which way I should interpret it. So I looked at the email, and I thought, should I do something here? Because I'd noticed that I wasn't sure if I was understanding what to do the same way as the requester. So I think I have a perspective mismatch. I decide to reach out. I look at the email and I say, who else is on this? Who could give me their perspective that we could then work with? So I found someone else who was on it. They were an architect. They were working with some other teams. And so I reached out to them and I said, hey, can we talk about this? I want to understand this better. And he said, sure. All right. Golden. We're negotiating. All right. So I sit down and I say, okay, this is the way I understand it. I can understand it in all these different ways. And he said, yeah, I had the same problem. This is the way that we decided to go ahead with it. And he gave me the kind of criteria of dependencies. And so I was like, great. All right. I've got now a consensual agreement, a consensual perspective. I can walk away with this and say, I've got an idea of what we should be doing. So then I went back to my desk, and I realized that there was actually another problem, another mismatch. My team was already working on all sorts of things, and I've got this new request. And it was labeled as urgent, but the content of it, I just like, I don't see how this can be urgent. I'm very confused. And I don't know how to match that up with what my team is doing. So I've got what I think is another perspective mismatch about how urgent this work is compared to my other stuff. So I go out and I reach out and I say, this time I can't go to the same architect because he, from our earlier discussion, didn't know either. So I go out and I talk to a person who'd kind of higher up in the organization. And I ask, can you give me some more information here? I want to understand the priority of this so I can make a trade-off with my team. And he refuses. So negotiating consensus was not entered into. I had reached out and told, no, you've got the information. It's urgent. Oh, okay. So I do know what to do now, but it doesn't fix my perspective mismatch. It doesn't fit my worldview. So I'm struggling with that. All right, but I can move ahead, as I said. I can still work with a perspective mismatch. All right, so I've now got all the information that I need. From the outer group, I've got what I can do, and I'm going to move into bunkering. We're going to cut off some information. We're going to kind of cut off the communication, and we're just going to get this going. So I go and I ask my team, who can work on this? This is what needs to get done. I tell them what I know. They have the exact same perspective mismatches that I have, and they reach out, and they're like, what are we supposed to do? So I talk to them. I do negotiating with them. I give them a consensual perspective, the best that I could understand that we should be doing. They take that on. They decide to start bunkering. So a few hours later, they come up with, here's a list. They give it to me, and they say, here's the work product. And I look at it and I say, you're missing an entire field here that needs to be filled in. They're like, oh, shit, yeah, we missed that. They thought that they understood what they needed to produce, and they were close, but not quite there. So they went back, they put that in, and brought it to me again. And I said, yep, that's it. That's, to the best of my knowledge, what I should be doing. So now, pop up a layer. So inner group has done their bunkering, has reconciled their perspective. We believe that we understand what we produced correctly. Pop up the other layer. I now take the work product and take it for accepting. Guy looks at it, and I bring it to him, and he's like, oh, that's a bit different than what I thought. But he decides, you know what, I'll accept it anyway. At this point, you kind of have to wonder, is the perspective mismatch reconciled or not? I don't know. But the model lets us ask that question. What has just happened here? So I did an accepting step, but none of us really quite agree, and we're noticing that. But he'll take it anyway. So you might say, our perspectives were close enough that he'll move ahead. Okay. So then he moves it on. He takes it, and he sends it out to the actual requesters of this. And at this point, I'm not sure what to call this, because you could say it's accepting. A work product was handed over. But in this case, there was no explicit acceptance or rejection provided. So it's kind of like a half accepted. Once again, the model is just giving us a way to think about it. What has occurred here? What might be there? What might be missing? How could it be different? And that's it. That's the example. That's what happened. And I never did hear back, so I don't know if what we produced was right or not. So I've taken you through a lot, I think, there. And the things I want you to take away from this, once again, to reiterate, because marketing is all about saying it again and again. The idea of grounded theory. It's a method that we can use to look a little bit more rigorously at the world around us and produce explanations that are grounded in that world. We don't have to do it to the full rigor of a scientific paper, but we can do it a bit more than our kind of like, I feel like it's this way. It can be quite useful. The other one is the theory of reconciling perspectives as a way of describing or interpreting the interactions on your teams. As you look at them debating or interacting or not interacting, you can look at it and say, what is going on here? Is this a debate about a consensual perspective? Did they reach a consensual perspective, or did everyone just walk away tired of the conversation? Did they ever actually get to a point where they accepted or rejected the idea? Or did they just kind of fizzle out? Are they actually reconciling their perspectives? Or is the perspective mismatch just a constant friction within the group? I think that we can use it as a way of examining the processes that we go through, the meetings that we have, and not telling us how to have the meeting, but giving us a lens to understand how is that meeting actually helping us or hindering us. And that's it. Thank you.